Thank you all so much for being here today on a sort of gloomy, cold, rainy day. Let's talk about some really interesting and important things. My name is Lauren Carruth, and I'm a professor here at the School of International Service, where I research and teach about humanitarianism and global health and migration. But first, before we begin, I actually want to dedicate today's events to one of our colleagues here from SIS who passed away really far too soon, really recently. Professor Chuck Call, I think some of us here in the room know him. One thing Chuck believed was that making the world a better place, building peace, improving foreign aid and foreign policy meant building personal relationships, friendships and partnerships across borders between different regions of the world, and here at home too in Washington, DC, and even in the halls of SIS. So his enthusiasm, his scholarship, his mentorship will be so very missed. So we hope to channel Chuck's passion and his faith and collaborative work here today. So now I'd like to welcome you to the School of International Service at American University, to the first in a series of events on the topic of, we're calling it Changing Aid, which is organized by myself, Susanna Campbell, Ernesto Castaneda, and Joe Young, all faculty here at AU, to better understand and work to transform international aid, especially in conflict and disaster-affected places. So stay tuned for a couple more events later this academic year. We're going to have another event in February and one in May, one to deal with what changes in the aid sector mean for the future of careers there. And then we'll have another event in May on localization and how to support new and innovative partnerships for aid. So this idea of changing aid has been supported by Vice Provost Diana Burley here at American University and Dean Shannon Hayter at SIS. The event today has also been supported by the Immigration Lab, led by Ernesto Castaneda, and the Mohammed Saeed Farsi Chair of Islamic Peace at American University with Elizabeth Thompson. This event is co-hosted with Georgetown University and would not have been possible without generous support from the Walsh School of Foreign Service, Georgetown's Institute for the Study of International Migration, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and the African Studies program. Finally, this event is made possible by a Title VI grant from the United States Department of Education, which is funding a national resource center on the Middle East and North Africa at Georgetown. So we're really appreciative of that. Today, we're convening a panel of experts at a really pivotal moment for the Horn of Africa. Despite a tentative peace agreement in Ethiopia, political violence, internal and international conflicts, and population displacements throughout the region continue. On top of this, the worst drought in decades and soaring global food prices have driven many to the brink of destitution. However, opportunities for these millions of people, both in danger and in need, to seek asylum, to seek refuge, to get assistance, are extremely limited. Lacking sufficient aid and sufficient protection, increasing numbers of people are seeking to migrate eastward and northward for work, mostly illegally or irregularly, as one form of escape. Each panelist today will speak about different aspects of this crisis in aid and the crisis of protection for migrants and refugees, both within and from the Horn of Africa. So our first panelist, I'm just going to introduce them now, and then they're going to speak for a few minutes based on their work. Our first panelist is Amina Saeed Shire. She's a social geographer and professor at the University of Djibouti, and she's founder of the Independent Research Institute for the Horn of Africa. Professor Shire has published numerous books and papers on migration, development, gender, long histories of violence that we both know too well, and social life in the Horn of Africa. So second then, we're going to hear from Professor Jennifer Riggin, who is a professor of international studies and director of the International Studies program at Arcadia University. She's the author of the book, The Struggling State, Nationalism, Mass Militarization, and the Education of Eritrea. And her second book, due out very soon, examines the lives, mobilities, struggles, and the temporal notion of waiting among so many Eritrean refugees throughout the Horn of Africa. Third, we're going to hear from Felege Berhan Balesti Meheret from George Mason University's Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. He has worked for numerous international organizations in the Horn of Africa and the UK, throughout Europe. And his doctoral dissertation, we're very excited about, is on migration governance and development aid, reinforcing cooperation on controlling mobility. Fourth, we will hear from Abdullahi Boru Halalke. He is the senior advocate for East and Southern Africa for Refugees International, which is, I mean, in my opinion, this is the top advocacy organization on behalf of migrants and displaced people based right here in Washington, D.C. Abdullahi has over a decade of experience in security, conflict, human rights, refugee work, and climate change. And he is regularly featured as an area expert and analyst in the global news media. Then finally, we have Professor Laura Smith, my research collaborator on many things, co-conspirator, and she is the co-convener of this event. She's a professor at the Walsh School of Foreign Service and director of the African Studies program at Georgetown. Laura will help moderate questions and discussion after our panelists provide their own insights on this broad topic. So thanks again so much for being here, and I'm going to turn this over to Amina.
Thank you. Before beginning my presentation, I would like to thank Dr. Lauren Caruth and Dr. Lara Smith, who have invited me to attend this conference and another conference in the next days. So I am happy to be here. Thank you. I am mainly a French speaker, so sorry for my poor English and my horrible accent.
Oh, no.
It is only my third communication in English. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. So I will focus on managing the migration management in the Horn of Africa, and mainly on the case of Djibouti. I don't know if you know where Djibouti is located. So it is located at a very strategic location at the crossroads between Asia, Africa, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean. Next. Djibouti is a very small country, only 1 million inhabitants, spread over only 23,000 square kilometers. It shares borders us with Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. And it is a very urbanized country. 80% is one of the most urbanized countries in Africa. And in 80% of the population live in cities, and 61% in the capital of the country. As you know, since the 70s, the Horn of Africa has suffered from disasters, hydroclimatic events, conflicts. So next, it's the region is marked by internal and international migrations. We have 3 corridors in the beginning, and also from the Horn of Africa, a land corridor which crosses Sudan, Libya, and then the Mediterranean Sea in order to reach Europe, a land and sea corridor which crosses Djibouti and Somalia and crosses the Gulf of Aden in order to reach an Arabian Peninsula. And you have also internal migration in the countries, between the countries of the Horn of Africa, and Djibouti, as you know, hosted many Ethiopian and Somali refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. Now in 2020 and 21, Djibouti hosted 35,000 refugees, mainly Ethiopian and Somali, but also 7,000 refugees from Yemen, some around 1,000 from Eritrea. It also hosted 150,000 migrants. So as you know, since 2,000 migrants have been transiting through Djibouti and crossing the Gulf of Aden in order to reach Arabian Peninsula. And before 2008, those migrants who are crossing the Red Sea were mainly Somali. And since 2008, they are mainly Ethiopian. So here we have a map with the corridors. Next. Yes. This is the land and sea corridor between the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. And the north, we will have the land corridor, which crosses Sudan, then Libya, then the Mediterranean Sea. And we have another one in the south, which crosses East Africa countries and Austral Africa countries in order to reach South Africa. You can go to the next. So here we have some, I said that Djibouti hosts something like 150,000 migrants. And among those migrants, we have a lot of street children and documented migrant children. So what are the drivers of this migration, internal and international migration? So as you know, there is some structural socioeconomic factors like the demographics in Ethiopia, the economics of Ethiopia. As I said, the migrants are now mainly from Ethiopia. And you have next. We have also some situational push factors, like the conflicts. Since 2014, Ethiopia has faced significant internal conflicts. The Oromo have been challenging central government decisions since 2014, and the launch of the Addis Ababa master plan, which encroaches on their land. The Amara are also challenging the confiscation of their land. The Tigranian are contesting the geopolitical composition of political alliances that marginalize them. And now the migrants leaving for political reasons are representing 1/4 of those migrants involved in the Eastern route. What are the pull factors? I said that Djibouti is a host country for migrants because of its level of economic development. Djibouti has now something like per capita GDP or $3,360, which is a lot in the region. So Djibouti has a big labor market, and migrants are a cheap source of labor that fills jobs left behind by Djiboutians. For the migrants from the region, Djibouti is a safer place to migrate than the Arabian Peninsula. Also, Djibouti, as I said, is a transit country for, like Yemen, for the migrants who are heading to the Arabian Peninsula. So for those migrants who are crossing the Red Sea, Saudi Arabia is the main destination state for migrants leaving the Horn of Africa. And the pull factors in this kingdom is mainly a large labor market in the domestic sector, in the agriculture sector, in the services sector. Also, we have attractive salary condition in Saudi Arabia, and the kingdom is not so far from the Horn of Africa. So what about the political management of the migration in and through Djibouti? We can distinguish 4 periods. The first period from the independence of Djibouti in 1977 to 2000, there was no political, the migration issue was not addressed politically. But in this first period, we had also migrants who had clan and family affinities with the Djiboutians, so they were integrated, they became Djiboutian citizens. For the second period, there was the emergence of a real migrant trafficking in the Horn of Africa, a lot of flows between the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. And so Djibouti tried to address the issue with a law in 2007 in order to prevent and repress any possible smuggling of migrants. For the third period, there always we can talk about a lack of real political leadership on the migration issue. And lastly, for the fourth period, Djibouti has finally adopted a national migration strategy. So, to addressing this issue, Djibouti is facing many challenges because, well, Djibouti is forced to make this issue, migration issue, a top priority because the importance of the flows transiting through its territory have placed it at the heart of the European campaigns to prevent irregular immigration. So in the region of the Horn of Africa, the European Union has outsourced its management of the migration issue to the region. And the implementation of the European strategy was entrusted to different technical partners, such as IOM, GIZ, NRC, DRC, and others, and even if IGAD, which is the intergovernmental authority for development in the Horn of Africa. And mainly IOM has been working with the Djiboutian government since 2009 to build its capacity in migration and border management. So I will let you read this one and go to the next directly. So as I said, Djibouti, like the other countries of the region, is in some way forced to make the migration issue a top priority. And here is the evidence. In 2018, Djibouti has adopted the Global Compact on Migration. A year later, it has identified its priority in the implementation of this Global Compact. 2021, Djibouti has defined his own migration governance indicator, has established a national coordination office, has adopted a national migration strategy. So Djibouti was forced to make this issue a top priority, but Djibouti does not have its own budgets to manage migration. It depends only on the European aid and the international organization aid. Meanwhile, the migrants face a lack of rights. They have no legal status. They work in the informal sector. They have problem to access to basic social services, except health services. We also have a lack of duty. Their work, they don't pay social taxes, which finance the basic social services. And ION is advocating for rights for those migrants, but the regularization of migrants is impossible in Djibouti for political reasons, because Djibouti has an existential problem to integrate all those migrants, because the population of Djibouti is only 1 million. And so if you have 1 million of Oromo people, it will be finished for. So it's very, very difficult to integrate and to give identification status, legal status for those migrants. Next. So the migration issue is very important in Djibouti as a host country and transit country, but its political management is still in its infancy, and it is encouraged by international organizations, donors like, and especially European Union. And Djibouti objectives often, when addressing the issue, Djibouti objectives often coincide with those of these donors, but when they aim to promote the return of the migrants, but when they diverge with those of donors when they aim to promote internal migration in the region to better combat international migration, because of this existential problem that I talked about. Thank you very much.
Next, we're going to hear from Professor Jennifer Riggin from Arcadia.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to try to manage my laptop and a microphone and not send one or the other flying in your direction. Wish me luck. So I want to begin with a quick disclaimer that I don't typically consider myself a scholar of migration. Laura and Lauren knew this going into this. My research has largely been driven by place and people, and by both personal connections as well as research, first in Eritrea and then with Eritrean refugees. And I mention that just because I think it's what I bring to this conversation is a view on migration of Eritreans in and out of Ethiopia that's based on a population and a particular group of people, which I think gives us a slightly different vantage point than if we're sort of taking the bird's eye view of these phenomena, and one that I think is really important, actually. So it's a disclaimer, but not to minimize anything that I'm saying. And I really appreciate Amina's overview of Djibouti and the region in general, and that's such a good perspective, and will help me explain some of the things I'm going to say. A couple of other notes before I move on. I use the term refugees to describe the population that I'm talking about. For a while, Eritreans received prima facie status as refugees in Ethiopia, so many of them were actually indeed legally refugees, but many are not. And indeed, if Eritreans migrate elsewhere, they won't have refugee status, but I believe it's extremely important to refer to people as refugees if they are people who are in need of refuge, and not be beholden to the sort of narrow legalistic categories of what a refugee is. So when I say refugees, I'm not limiting myself to the legal definition of refugee, and I think it's important to acknowledge that refugees are people who need refuge and protection. I'm also not going to be talking too much about Afar refugees in Ethiopia. Eritrean Afar refugees are a really important population to consider. I wish I understood their circumstances better, and I'll try to address it as much as I can, but I haven't been able to be super knowledgeable about them, but I wanted to flag that is an important population. So please don't let me ramble on for more than too many minutes, because I really want to get us to discussion. But I want to talk about a few things. First, I'll talk a little bit about my last ethnographic study of Eritrean refugees, which I did along with my colleague Amanda Poole, and the findings that will be coming out in our forthcoming book based on research from 2016 to roughly 2019. And then I'll bring us up to the present a bit and talk about the situation currently for Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia. And then I'm going to conclude with a few sort of tentative thoughts on what I've been calling and thinking about in my own head as the political economy of misery. So just first, a little bit of background for people who may not know. Eritrean refugees have been fleeing from an extreme authoritarian regime, a place where many have floundered in endless national service for decades, in a condition that some scholars have referred to as national slavery. And the few who do manage to evade national service can still be recalled for military service and other kinds of service in Eritrea. In short, in Eritrea, there's no political freedom, no press freedom, constant arbitrary roundups and arrests, Eritreans have fled from this situation in all directions, often taking themselves on circuitous routes, going east to Gulf countries in order to save money for passage to the west, or going south and then going west to South America and making their way up through the grueling passage to get to the US-Mexico border. Sudan and Ethiopia are often the initial stopover countries, as is Djibouti in some cases, for this circuitous and grueling journey. At the time of my fieldwork, Sudan was in many ways a less popular place for people to go to due to concerns about Eritrean security forces there, worries about being deported back to Eritrea. And at the time, around 2016-17, Ethiopia looked like one of the more promising and safer places for Eritreans. So when Amanda and I began our fieldwork in summer 2016, it was a somewhat cautiously optimistic time. Ethiopia at that time was being heralded for its efforts in refugee hosting. They took the lead in the New York Summit on Refugees and Migration, which later resulted in the subsequent compacts on refugees, global compacts on refugees and migration. The country was praised for its 9 pledges, which were oriented around making Ethiopia a more hospitable, long-term home for refugees. And pledges promised things like, for some refugees that had been in the country for a very long time, a pathway to citizenship, for some land rights, for many, increased access to education, including university education. There was talk about jobs, particularly jobs in industrial parks. There was talk about assuring refugees the ability to get documentation for marriages, refugee status, various different things. All of which was supposed to encourage refugees to consider Ethiopia a more long-term home. Refugees, meanwhile, were skeptical about how these pledges would really change anything for them. And for a long time, nothing really changed. Then finally, in 2019, the pledges were signed into law with the new refugee proclamation in Ethiopia. However, almost immediately after that, 2 additional regulations, which specified how processes would actually work out, were passed, which effectively rendered many of the gains by the pledges and the proclamation negligible. And indeed, from what people tell me now, the details about how refugees can particularly get out of camp status or the right to work remain caught in a sort of bureaucratic morass, and people haven't really been able to figure out how to get access to these things, even though they're supposedly guaranteed by law. During the course of our research, which focused on forms of temporal violence and temporal agency and their impact on how refugees thought about migration, we developed a concept of teleological violence to demonstrate what happens when refugees are socialized, disciplined, or led to believe in a particular notion of forward-thinking incremental progress, when in fact there are a great deal of structural barriers, stringent structural barriers that impede their progress. We looked particularly at refugees who had been given access to university education and university scholarships, who had been given these great opportunities, believed that this would give them a chance to progress, and then in many, many cases, if not most cases, wound up back in camps, floundering in camps, feeling incredibly depressed. And what we kept hearing again and again is that this is a damaging condition. This is a psychologically damaging condition, and this actually encourages us to want to take the risks of irregular migration across. Typically, the most typical route people would take was the land route across to Libya, across the Mediterranean. And that the notion of progress was sort of a double-edged sword, that of course nobody said that they didn't want to have access to university education or education. That was a positive, but it was also a painful progress because people could never actually reach the progress that they were planned. And we might think about Ethiopia's pledges and the later refugee policy as in a similar light, that these promised something, they promised a certain kind of progress that then was blocked in pretty systematic ways again and again. This might be thought of in a similar way to Arjuna Padurai's sense of lacking the capacity to aspire. They had been socialized and trained to aspire, but the capacity was not there because there was no mechanism for them to aspire. And this refugees again connected with migration as an option to aspire. Since our fieldwork wrapped up, things have worsened exponentially. Despite great optimism, when Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed became prime minister and declared peace with Eritrea, Eritrean refugees from the beginning were extremely worried about the declaration of peace. The border opened in fall 2018, and then the border crossings over the next few months closed one by one, leaving only irregular border crossings open as of March 2019. The irregular border crossings, which were still open, was a vast improvement, as the border used to be very heavily militarized on the Eritrean side, and there was in fact a shoot-to-kill policy for anyone crossing the border. When the border opened, a flood of new Eritrean refugees fled into Ethiopia from Eritrea. until very quietly at some point in 2020, the last date I heard was March 2020, the Ethiopian government revoked Eritreans' prima facie refugee status and started requiring Eritreans to apply for refugee status. As far as I can tell, few, if any, Eritreans have been able to get status since the Ethiopian government stopped giving Eritrean status. It's very difficult for them to get status. Then, of course, in November 2020, war broke out in the Tigray region. Eritrean refugees, by all accounts, were targeted from all sides, if not many sides in the conflict, subject to horrific atrocities, including rape as a war crime, along with the Ethiopian civilian population in Tigray. Eritrean forces forcibly repatriated Eritreans. Tigray militias targeted Eritreans as revenge for what the Eritrean forces did to Tigrayan civilians. 2 of the 4 camps in the Tigray region, Hitsats and Shemelbo, were destroyed. Refugees who fled to Addis Ababa initially received no support and eventually, after protesting, received some support. Early on in the conflict, some were forcibly returned to Tigray. Refugees who fled to the Amhara region, where eventually a new camp, Alamwach, was set up in the Gondar region, have reported being targeted because they speak Tigrinya and are confused with Tigrayans. And all on top of this, Tigray was an active war zone, and the refugee camps that were remaining, that weren't destroyed, were often on the front lines of the war, and deprivation of food aid was used as a strategy of war that affected both the civilian population as well as the refugee population and has resulted in severe food insecurities in Tigray. By all accounts, the new camp in the Amhara region is unsafe, and refugees continue to be targeted from all sides if they try to flee the camp. I heard some accounts saying that refugees from, now that there's a ceasefire, that refugees from the remaining camps in Tigray are being forced to go to the Alamwach camp, where they're not really allowed to leave. They're not given the same freedoms that they had at one point in the camps in Tigray. Those camps lack facilities, they lack housing, they lack shelter. They're also not very secure, and there have been accounts of attacks on refugees in those camps, as well as robberies. I also heard other accounts that some refugees who would like to get out of Tigray are not able to go to the Alamwach camp because they don't have formal official refugee status. So in both cases, these are fairly dire situations. Eritrean refugees in Addis Ababa are also struggling. Prejudices and animosities from Ethiopians are on the rise. Eritrean refugees are increasingly blamed for increases in rent and other political problems. As the Ethiopian economy falters, petty crime is on the rise, and in areas where refugees live, refugees are often blamed for this rise in crime. There have been arrests of refugees along with other Tigrinya speakers, and there's occasionally rumors of collaboration between Ethiopian and Eritrean security actors in Addis Ababa, which of course puts Eritrean refugees in dangerous positions. Since March 2020, Eritreans have had to undergo status determination as refugees, and very few, if any, have been able to get refugee status. So there are also problems with them getting documentation, which is particularly problematic if a refugee has a family reunification case or a resettlement process, because they, of course, need documentation to do that. So that can also drive irregular migration, as if people don't have status and they can't go through their regular channels, and they have family reunification, they may need to go to another country in order to process try to get documentation. But I've also heard that even many Eritreans who do have refugee status are leaving Ethiopia because there just aren't very many good options for them in Ethiopia anymore. Ethiopia overall seems to be moving back to an encampment model of refugee management after when we first started our field work, and ARA, the Ethiopian Association for Refugee and Returnee Affairs, now called the Refugee and Returnee Services. A representative told me, he said, in 10 years, we will have no more refugee camps, because that was very much the vision, was local integration. Let's move people out of camps. And now Ethiopia seems to be much more back in an encampment model. Because of difficulties getting services and documents, it seems to be less and less a hospitable place for Eritrean refugees in particular. And there are tremendous concerns for safety. So many Eritreans may be moving on from Ethiopia, but finding difficult circumstances elsewhere as well. Around 2017, in my own undergraduate classes, I found myself lecturing on what I called the political economy of misery. And I coined that term, or maybe somebody else coined it. I haven't looked up to see if anyone actually has it. I think it's a good term. But I started talking about that to capture the role of desperation in the complex political economy that has emerged around migration towards Europe and other destination points in the global north, where barricading borders, blocking ships from undocking, not saving people, pushing people back to the shores of Libya, combined with people's actual desperation and need to get to a safe place, creates this sort of bottleneck where people's actual misery and desperation can be a source of value for criminal groups who may hold people for ransom and torture them, who may sell people into slavery, who may smuggle and traffic people and put them in terrible conditions. And I think it's important to look at that because often there's a blaming of the smuggler in that equation and saying the problem is just the smugglers. But I think we need to look at the political economy of everything that starts with the initial country and the desperation that causes people to leave, that goes to the intermediary host country, to places like Ethiopia, which are suddenly unstable and no longer places where people can be, and then looks at where people are trying to go and that there literally is no safe corridor. And so when people have that kind of desperation, it creates a political economy that fuels smuggling industries, or industries where people can be trafficked, industries where people, all kinds of horrible things can happen to people. And I think Eritreans are a particularly acute case of this because there is desperation on all sides. And it's only gotten worse with the onset of the war in Ethiopia. So effectively, misery is lucrative and value can be extracted from desperation. And I think we all have a responsibility to look at that and look at how that works and to see what countries in the global north that are target countries are doing that are fueling that particular kind of political economy.
Thank you so much. Let's hear from Felage first, and then we'll go to Abdullahi.
Thank you for having me. I'll be talking about a few concepts I believe will help us discuss, I think also referring to Amina's presentation, and to look at into the phenomenon and labeling migration as a crisis. And I hope these concepts can actually serve us to think about contextualizing and critiquing the wider debate on migration governance and development aid. So I'll just divide my my discussion into three parts. One is looking at the migration governance and question the need, why there's the need to govern migration. And I'm using migration governance as an overarching framing of migration as a crisis and the subsequent actions taken by migrant recipient countries. So whose interest is, to govern migration, and what kind of power relationship agency exists between the country of the recipient countries and the migrants sending countries. And I would argue that migration governance, I think, should be seen as a strategy of organizing people's movement and deterring human mobility. The other section I would love to talk about is the framing of migration as a crisis, also leads to with this whole idea of the securitization of migration. And I'll talk a little bit about who frames migration as a crisis and why. And the third part, which relates to the same concept of framing migration as a crisis, helps or make us to think about perhaps looking at development problem and the Horn of Africa as something that needs to be fixed. So that also will help us to discuss about some of the concepts here. So when I use the term governance, I'm looking at different scholars' use of the term itself, and one to use is Alexander Bates' definition of migration governance as norms, rules, principles, and decision-making procedures that regulate the behavior of the state and also transnational actors. So it's not only about regulating their norms and behaviors, but also the extent to which these norms and behaviors and policies are constraining and constitutive of the behavior of the state and other transnational actors, as that's been mentioned with IOM and other organizations. That's also, governance is also this purposeful activity intended to control and influence someone else, which could be the state, individuals, and also other actors. Hence, the framing of migration as a trait from a migrant recipient countries, and looking at development aid as a crisis for the origin countries, it creates this need that something is to be controlled, or the movement itself needs to be controlled. So it has a goal of organizing human mobility and disciplining movement and behaviors of the state, and also the irregular, again, using the term irregular as coined by the ones that are recipient countries. I think it's important also to see the notion of migration governance to probe the power dynamics that exist between the donor and recipient countries. Whenever there is that relationship in which, the other one country or one region is providing aid and then expecting something which creates dependency, at the same time, it creates that relationship where policies has to be followed according to the one who gives the money. And I think I was just mentioning earlier how Djibouti is being funded and how there are many policies coming up now, but it's all because of the funding and the policy prescriptions by the European unions. So part of this migration agenda from the donor perspective is a process of framing migration again as a crisis, as problematic and as an issue that requires a fix, which could also be done through the securitization of migration. And probably most of you know about the securitization of migration and how it's been defined as a process of a speech act in which different actors use speech and different narratives to frame what migration is as a problem and as something that needs to be treated. So when we look at migration, again, labeling and the whole idea of the securitization, categorization of migrants sending countries as problematic, we also see how irregular migrants have become a scapegoat for the economic woes, and also how lower age, cultural, and other religious problems in the recipient countries, especially European countries. So my research is more focused about European countries. So when I talk about these different initiatives or policy prescriptions, I'm talking about the EU and their engagement with African countries. So such framing of migration as a security threat allows EU countries to devise strategies to tackle a situation as a security matter. Again, different scholars have theorized about this. And also I think what the Copenhagen School talk about securitization as the intersubjective and socially constructed process by which a threat to a particular referent object is acknowledged and deemed worth protecting is something we can use to actually look at and understand what happens with the securitization of migration. Again, with this whole speech act, narratives, labeling, and categorization, it gives most donors or European countries to look at or frame the issue, again, migration as an issue that requires an emergency measure, something that needs to be tackled immediately. And we can talk about, I think earlier, I was also mentioned about the EUTF, the European Emergency Trust Fund that came about after the 2015. The other, I think, important way to look into the whole idea of securitization and migration governance is how we should look at migration as a politics of migration, or the politics of migration as politics of membership. If you look at European countries with their Schengen visas and others, Europeans can actually circulate around any European country and work, and it's called as a positive and a free movement of their citizens. But when it comes to migrants or irregular migrants, or when we look at the skilled versus the unskilled labor, the seasonal versus the irregular, there is that framing which creates the other to actually stay where they are. And I think such classifications on the movement of people creates this political discourse that frames migration as a dysfunctional problem, a trait that requires a fix through appropriate policies. And one of these provisions or these policy prescriptions are framing migration crisis as a development problem, and assumption that providing development aid can actually fix the problem in these migrant sending countries. As we all know, African countries, my research focuses more on looking at the Ethiopian case, but also doing a comparative study with Eritrea and Morocco and how European policies are, providing aid. But aid has been, it's been there for a longer period of time within African countries since, they're looked as poor, and provision of aid is looked at something that would solve the problem. But these days, the framing of migration, again, as a development problem, allows European countries to fund and to inject more funds into these countries and change the norms, behaviors, and how states actually work on their own policies. For example, in the case of Ethiopia, there hasn't been a national migration policy for a longer period of time, but now there is a push towards a national migration policy. The refugee policies that has been just mentioned are also part of this funding processes. For example, scholars like Beckwell explains this tendency to see migration as a symptom of failure in development provides the justification for donors to engage in interventionist development. We're there to provide you the solution. We're there to fix your poverty, conflict, bad governance, all sorts of ideas that they assume is a problem is then provided as a means to change through aid. So I would argue that development aid is an extension of securing the borders in the country of origin. So mostly when we talk about securitizing migration and the whole idea of, protecting Europe, we're talking about the borders. But I believe development aid is also this transnational and also governing at distance by provision of aid and keeping people where they are or deter their movements. And specifically looking at the European Union and the many European countries, they've been engaged with African countries for a longer period of time. If we look at the 1999 Tampere Agreement, there has been a common EU asylum and migration policy in which they agreed that there is a need to establish partnership with countries of origin to address the political, human rights, and development issues in countries of origin. The 2006 Joint Africa-EU Declaration on Migration and Development, again, reasserts the need and the strategy for African countries and to look at for the need to manage migration. It also brought forward the agenda for development and migration as a potential strategy for addressing root causes of migration. And there are also other regional initiatives. I'm sure you guys might know a lot of them. The Rabat process in 2006, which was done between Northwest and Central Africa and the EU. The Khartoum process, which focused on the Horn of Africa, which includes Djibouti, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Egypt, and Tunisia. And the recent European Trust Fund is also something my research focuses on after the Valletta Summit in 2050, which further strengthens the continued partnership and the need for cooperation with African countries. So at the Valletta Summit, they agreed to address, again, root causes of irregular migration and forced displacement. And they have been funding more than 4.8 billion throughout different parts of Africa, and there are 3 groups to the EETF. So I believe these frameworks are evident in highlighting the approach adopted by the European Union and establishing partnership with African countries for an effective governance of migration. But just to give another, I think, angle is there are so many evidences and research that have focused on that shows that, even with the provision of aid, there are empirical evidence that shows aid by itself might even encourage migration rather than deterring migration. So within the provision of aid, it could be to education and other, in other ways of helping people, but it's only those who have the means who can actually migrate. It's only the means, those maybe who are educated, those with a little amount of, financial ability that could actually migrate. So there is also a counter evidence to, the impact of development aid. So maybe it's time for us to think about, changing aid and how we perceive the migration governance.
Thank you. Abdullahi, you're up
Yes.
next.
Good afternoon. It's either a curse or a blessing to be the last person to speak, in the sense that everything has been spoken, so you feel like you don't have a ton of points to make. But it's also a blessing because you can pick up other people's points. Yeah, I think I want to use 2 points as a jumping off points. One is the question around the Eritrean refugees. It's a subject that, has been discussed, but I think it's a subject that is also very important where, yes, there is the refugee and migration crisis in the Horn, but not every group experiences the crisis the same way. Right. Here are people who, they've left their own country and now they are refugees, but they are being targeted for being refugees in that country again. So I think it is also very important to not just look at crisis, but there are crises within the crisis. And so, in the Eritrean cases, there are around 100,000 Eritreans inside Ethiopia. And once the war broke out 2 years ago, almost slightly over 2 years ago, they were the primary targets, like it's been explained. The second thing that I wanted to speak about is the question around solutionism, around refugees, humanitarian work. I think more than any other region on the continent, the Horn of Africa region is beset with multiple crises. Some man-made, right? I mean, you can pick your country, be Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti, and you can go and check against all the available indices, whether it's poverty, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, Eritrea. If you have on the one extreme, you have Eritrea, where there's no, political party apart from, the national party, where there is no freedom of expression, where there are no official political opposition, where there is no, media apart from the national media. And then you have the Kenya, on the other hand, where it has a provision of some of this. Or you can take, poverty indices. You can look at all the countries in the Horn. They don't do that very well. When you layer that with, a natural problem where in the Horn now, I think over the last few years now, I think the average temperature has increased by at least 2 degrees. And that is incredibly difficult for a region that majority rely on pastoralism as a mode of livelihood. That makes it incredibly difficult. These are people who rely on largely rain-fed agriculture, 80% in Ethiopia, in many parts of the region that rely on pastoralism moving from one place to another. So that makes it very difficult now as we speak. The region is experiencing a drought that has not been experienced over the last 40 years. Upward of 30 million people are in need of humanitarian aid. And you also have a conflict, in Ethiopia the last 2 years. That conflict has displaced thousands of people internally, close to 2 million by the end of 2021, which is the highest in any other country. That makes it very difficult. And so the region really is consistently facing crises. Like the Horn of Africa region, whichever way you slice, you can go back 10 years, 15 years, but those crises will continue getting very acute as we go along. The other point that I wanted to make is the question about, here, at least in the West, here meaning the United States and European Union, there is a fair degree of retreat from the global refugee protection mechanisms. All right. It is a very radioactive domestic political issue where parties on the right consistently now make migration their central issue. To the extent that even the party on the left or the Democratic Party in this country are afraid to make migration a central point of their discussion. So they have to run away from it because it's a subject that has got considerable electoral consequences. All right. But while that is going on here and many Western countries, in the region, there is a fair degree of solutionism, whether it is through aid, whether it is through helping technically some of these countries to develop refugee and migration policies that can work. Right. And so these two forces consistently are in dialogue, sometimes contradicting each other, sometimes making things very difficult. So as a response to that, whether it's the EU, where it has offshored most of refugee migration work, or, making hostile environment where coming into any of these countries now for people who want to come is difficult. A lot of the time we spend, a considerable amount of energy explaining, regular migration. It is incredibly difficult for you to come here. I mean, visa offices are sites of violence. Visa offices, you cannot get visa. I mean, I think until a few weeks ago when the new American ambassador to Kenya came, I think the earliest visa appointment that you can get in Kenya was in 2024. I mean, even if you wanted to come here as a student for medical reasons, for other reasons, it is incredibly difficult. And then that feeds into the misery of the political economy of misery, where people, including people from the region, are becoming really good at, exploiting the misery that people are dealing with. So I was told to explain, my role here really was to try and explain some of the challenges that we face, or groups like ourselves face, in trying to address some of these very complex and complicated problems. And, some of the challenges that we really face, immigration is becoming a hot title in this region. So how do you advocate for that? Then it comes to what my colleague spoke about as a management. Migration is not here, it's managed, it has to be managed. And that means nothing moves, it's just you're shoving people from one region to another, from one office to another. And it's death by bureaucracy, where you'll wait for your day to, for you to get an appointment. I think in my region, the other thing that is incredibly becoming very difficult is the Ukrainian crisis, right? Because it's not only taking attention, political and diplomatic effort from the region, but it is also taking resources that ideally would go to this region. Right, the Horn of Africa humanitarian plan, I think, is to a tune of 4.4 billion. All right, and so as a result, the region hasn't probably even received 2 billion of that. And so, the UN World Food Program, WHO, FAO, UNICEF, all of them are struggling to program. And some of this, if you speak to most of them, they say we have to make a choice between programming to give people who are desperately on their deathbed and moving stuff around to ensure that people stay alive. So I think those are some of the issues that we deal with, but also COVID. Because COVID made things incredibly difficult, and to begin with, it made people, once countries closed their borders, especially for people in the Horn, where ideally it's via Djibouti to Yemen, and then or Somalia, and then you go to the Gulf countries. That became incredibly difficult. And so people resorted to using routes that were not safe and secure, and that led to so many deaths and destruction. I think the Ukraine angle sometimes gets a little bit difficult because, here is a country that is facing all the problems in the world. But at the same time, when, for instance, a country like Somalia relies on, it imports 90% of its wheat requirement from that region. And because of that also, again, attention is taken away from them, diplomatically, financial, and other things, then it becomes very difficult. Then it becomes a circular problem that needs to be solved. Finally, I think migration is a lot of the migration, at least in the region, significant chunk of people actually do not go to other countries, in the sense that they do not come here, or they do not go to Europe. Just to give you an example, I think Ethiopia right now is hosting something like 0.8 million refugees. Kenya is hosting, slightly over 500,000 refugees. So I think a lot of people from the region actually do not come here. But that doesn't prevent, the harsh policy, securitization, offshoring of refugees and migration. So I'll leave it at that. And, I'll be happy to engage in Q&A. I think that's where a lot of these discussions can be unpacked slightly better.
Thank you so much.
Well, I will chime in here to thank all of our panelists. And I'm sure I speak for all of us in the room to say that there's a lot of things that have been said that are really thought-provoking for me. And I really want to thank each of you for the time that you've put into these presentations today, and for all of you all for coming out to be with us here for this conversation. I know you all probably are eager to have questions, so I'll pose one just to get us started and begin to collect your questions, and I'll have plenty of time to call on folks in the audience. So start to think about what you'd like to ask the panelists. I was struck that a lot of you all touched on this, the extent to which xenophobia, scapegoating, this sort of real targeting of migrants, refugees, of the various folks in the region happens, and that's sort of happening near and far. I mean, I sort of had this sense of sort of there's the close by, right? There's in Djibouti, there's in Ethiopia, there's inside countries that this happens. But really, we can think of these externalization and securitization policies as that happening from afar. I was really struck, Feliga, by really thinking about the securitization policies as contrasted by, say, Schengen as really that from afar. And it's a really, but I think it was coming to me from all of these presentations and ways of thinking about it. And so I appreciate that. And I think that's really important to think about. But then I think coming back to the point that you were just making, Abdullahi, and sort of still avoiding solutionism, but sort of thinking, how can we push then, right? If most of the folks are being hosted in the region by either displaced within countries, or by neighboring countries, but resources are needed, right? And we are the folks sitting here who might pressure governments to provide various kinds of resources. What are sort of intersectional ways that we can think about linking those? So I'm thinking around climate. Several of you also mentioned the way that these are linked to climate. Is climate an example of a way that we can sort of link migration in ways to kind of create policy, push? Are there other kind of intersectional ways? Gender has not come up in our conversation as sort of the intersectional nature of and youth. That's another, really important topic. The important intersectional nature of many migrants being young people, adolescents, or young folks in their 20s, and so on. So are there other ways that we can sort of think of the intersectional nature and other intersectional topics in terms of sort of pushing for thinking about less scapegoating, less xenophobic responses to migration, emanating both near and far, right? So within the region and from afar. Sorry, it's a big question. I don't know if anybody wants to. You want to start? Yeah, thanks.
Sorry. I think I'm glad you brought up the xenophobia. That it's not just a copyrighted thing that only happens here. It happens also in the region. The Somali refugees in Kenya are not looked at as other refugees. So they're always looked at as refugees, but they are always seen as without evidence. Like you always hear, oh no, Al-Shabaab is using the Dadaab refugee camp as a breeding ground. A government minister said that there has been threats to close the Dadaab refugee camp without any evidence. But yeah, that is something that is very important. I think with respect to solutionism, with respect to solution without getting into solutionism, I think there are few areas. I think they are very nascent, and it will take some time, and the proof is in how it will be implemented. Kenya has a new refugee law now that was just passed a few months ago, and it's the Kenya Refugee Law 2021. It provides pathways to. The incumbent policy is even whereas even the Kenyan government will not want to come out publicly and acknowledge it, is not an effective policy. It's been there since 1991. There are kids who've gone to school there, had life there. That is not how you can solve this problem sustainably. So they are offering a pathway to work. You can work. You don't need to be in the refugee camp. If you have credentials from whichever country that you have, it can be examined, brought to the same level with the Kenyan credentials. That is, your certification. And then you can also, it allows for freedom of movement because you don't sit there. So that I think is an option. I think the other option is in Tanzania, I think should be 2008, if I'm not mistaken, gave pathway to citizenship. 200,000, Burundians were given a chance to be citizens of Tanzania. I think the Kenya one, because of the East African community, has a potential because you have to give up your refugee status for you to become a member of the East African community, and the charter that establishes the East African community allows for you to be the citizen of the entire community. You can be a Burundian refugee. If you feel like Kenya is no good in terms of work and everything for you, you can go to another country in the region. I think there are around 4, 5, 6, 7 countries. So I think that can help. But I think it is new. But I think without question, it will have some problems. Without questions, there are certain provisions that you lose. The protections that you have as a refugee, you lose some of them. Then what does that mean? The other challenge really is, it's fairly anecdotal, but most of the refugees, when you ask them, they still prefer, with all the things that we've said, they still prefer resettlement here or in Europe. So how do you convince them that, it's not as friendly as you might think? That is an incredibly difficult job to do, to convince them. Finally, without holding the microphone for too long, is the climate change. I think the thing about climate change is, whether we like it or not, it doesn't respect borders. We can keep our borders and we can take it as seriously as we want, and there's no problem with that. People will move. People will be forced to move, whether we want it or not. Like in the region, in the Horn of Africa, which is already very vulnerable at structural level, the governance structures, the food insecurity, all those things will increase. And people will not sit on their hands, to wait for you to come and help them. They will move. And so how do you address that, I think, will become very important. I think in terms of framing, I think mostly in the United States, I think seeing it as a national security with all its danger. I know that, but I think once it's framed as that, then maybe, just maybe, politicians and policymakers will start seeing it as something that needs to be addressed as such.
I'll just say one quick, there's so much wonderful stuff there. I'm not going to pick up on what you said because I can't, but I just wanted to say a quick word in response to Laura's original question about intersectional ways to think about allocating resources for some of these problems, and climate, gender, and youth are certainly great ways to think. But I think we also need to add race to that, if we're taking seriously anti-racism as a global, not just a domestic issue, I think that there's clear racial biases, both in the migration management system, as Belgi was talking about, and in the refugee protection system. And as we have this moment of greater awakening and awareness around race, I think that that's another important way to mobilize resources and to call out these systems for their really clear racism.
And great. Why don't I collect some more questions? So what I was thinking is I'll collect like maybe 3 questions together, and then we'll answer those, and then we'll have time for more. That way we'll gather a couple, a collection of them for our panelists. So if anybody wants to line up here and pose your questions, no questions? Yeah, please come on up. And so we'll just line right up here at this microphone. And we'll take maybe 3 questions or so for the panel, and then we'll answer those as a collection. Yeah, feel free.
Hi, thank you very much, everyone, for your very informative insights. I work at the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, and I went to Morocco in September for a conference on migration. And one of the points that the minister had spoken about was that Morocco has become a transit country because of its advanced migration policy, which was kind of like resonating with what one of the other speakers said. But I have a question about return and reintegration policy, because as we've seen in a lot of the countries that have experienced extreme outmigration for multiple years, like over 40, 50 years, a lot of the minorities who have outmigrated are experiencing cultural genocide as a result of losing their native land, their status, statelessness within camps that they have over multiple generations reproduced. And so my question is about this. International law on returning and reintegration, or returning of migrants, passively or implicitly enables countries to prematurely return irregular migrants that don't have status, which basically enables those states to forcibly deport under the guise of the national security issue. So if most refugees have been surveyed, according to UNHCR, that they would prefer to return home if given the opportunity to reestablish themselves, reunite with their families, and create livelihood in their home country or country of origin. How can we create a policy that enables this from the culturally and contextually informed approach to return migration and reintegration strategy? Because of the problem of cultural genocide as a result of statelessness or protracted refugee camp housing or warehousing. Thank you.
Let's grab another question. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Layla. I'm an undergrad studying peace and conflict in the Horn of Africa here at SAS. And I had a question regarding Somalia and Somaliland, the contention they have regarding the recognition of Somaliland officially. Has the somewhat contentious relationship between Somalia and Somaliland influenced the overall country's role in navigating migration and the politics of membership? Thank you.
One more question? Nobody? All right, well, let's go ahead and take these two. Yeah, please go on up, Saif.
Okay. My name is Saif Ayalo. I'm from George Mason University. So my question when it comes to the aid and donor landscape in terms of migration management, it seems to me like whenever I hear this discussion, I mean, I didn't mean the presenters, but overall the conversation is very European centric, in the sense that what can donors do to address this problem? It's all about Europe. The conversation is in Brussels or Washington. So why don't we, is there any discussion or conversation to take this conversation in Africa, maybe in Addis Ababa or Abuja? So how does the aid recipient countries see this? What are the challenges of these so-called developing countries to address this issue of migration? Because for me, the way migration has been presented is in its liberal conception, is the embodiment of liberal internationalism, which talks about all rights of refugees and everything. It's a broken promise, right? Especially from developing world countries. So how do we take this from this pseudo-liberal internationalism conversation into a more concrete challenge, practical experience of African countries in terms of managing the problem of migration, which is not an isolated technical development issue, but it has got to do with unfair trade. It has got to do with unilateral collective punishment that these countries are facing because of some very unrealistic human rights standards, which most of European countries doesn't even respect, right? So how do we relate this with sanction, unfair trade deals, and global debt crisis? global political economy of that very much is embedded into. Thank you for your intervention when it comes to racial dimension of it, but also how about the colonial legacy of trying to solve Africa's problem? So it would be nice if you reflect on this thing. Thank you.
Oh, you've got three big questions, panel. Who would like to go first? Yeah.
All of them are very interesting questions. I think to link what Laura asked first and what Saifa just asked, I think in terms of this aid donors, especially the focus on this Eurocentric focus on providing the solutions, I think it's very important to think about agency, which I wanted to highlight earlier. In most cases, I mean, since way back, with the World Bank, the IMF, we've seen how aid actually has impacted African countries, by providing a lot of aid and keeping them in date. There's with all sorts of conditionality that has been, happening in African countries has impacted them. But to what extent is there the agency of the state in prescribing the solutions? It's not only about, the one who has the means or the money, but I think it's very important to have an equal kind of understanding or an equal opportunity for the state itself to negotiate the policies and the policy prescriptions that comes with the funding. In most cases, there is no solution within, even if there are solutions available within the state with the migrant sending countries, with money, with the donor, always comes with a solution, which is pretty much with conditionality and forcing them to actually accept this kind of, aid relationship. So I think the intersectionality with the West and, the South should also be about the agency of the state. For example, in the case of Ethiopia, of course, there is a large number of unemployed youths. And if it's the government, I'm sure they would say, yes, we have unemployed youths. And maybe one solution is, to have a clear regular channels for migration, but that wouldn't be possible, or that wouldn't be that much easier within the EU itself, because again, there's this perception of us versus them with the whole idea of, keeping them where they are. And also what we discussed earlier about the offshoring of refugees, what the UK government did, recently is also taking away, even not being able to accept refugees and, be willing to provide the solution. And I think when I talk about the state agency, I had recently the chance in 2019 to go to Eritrea, and we talked to these ministers, and they have their own narratives about, for example, the push factor for migration. They said, all these European countries are creating this space for refugees. They're claiming Eritrea has a problem, and that's why people are moving. That's their narrative. So what kind of solutions can the state itself, the migrant state, can provide in order to address these issues? And the other question about the reintegration of returnees. Again, if we talk to returnees, in the case of Ethiopia, for example, those who've been deported from Saudi Arabia, they so much want to go back. It's not about just creating the space in their homeland or providing, all the best opportunities for them to return, but they have the intention to go back because they would make a better living. But there is still that narrative of, claiming sending them back home is the best solution. But is it really the best solution for the migrants themselves? Do they have a say in what they want to do, be it as a refugee, be it as an irregular migration? What kind of solution can they come up with? Or what is their say in addressing their own problems of being an irregular migrant? And maybe one point to add is in terms of protection, as much as there is a push, as much as there is restrictive policies against African countries, I think there needs to be an enforcement towards creating a policy that can actually protect the migrants wherever they might go. How about the Europeans? How about the Arab countries provide a protective laws and policies that can guarantee protection for them to stay, work, and, if they want to return, of course, return to their homeland.
Thank you. about the returnees and reintegration, we have a very interesting case in Djibouti. It is about the Yemeni refugees. They were at the beginning of the war, of the Yemeni war in 2015, they were 5,000 present in a refugee camp in the north of Djibouti. But they began to go back to, it was so hard. So it's a refugee camp is not a very good place. So they, and in Djibouti, Yemen is distant from Djibouti only 23 kilometers. So it's very easy to go and to come back. And they began to go back, to return to Yemen, even if it is, it was still the war. And we have, so those refugees who go back to their country, which is still in war, and sometimes they come back in Djibouti and reintegrate the refugee camp. But we have this kind of issues. So, but according the reintegration of and irregular migrants, it is, the issue is addressed in Djibouti only by IOM, which has a program with the Ethiopian government and Djiboutian government, and they send back the people and they come back. After a few months, they come back because there is no solution there. They face the discrimination. And they are forced to come back and to try again to cross the Red Sea in order to try again to reach Saudi Arabia.
Anyone else?
Just one other comment about the question about the donor, the aid donor recipient, that just to take us back to that 2016 moment in Ethiopia. And ARA at that time, and Ethiopia in general, was really positioning itself as an actor in that transaction between international donors and Ethiopia as host state. And I think really trying to reconfigure itself as playing a really significant role politically in the global migration management, refugee hosting order, and recognizing that, yeah, we need the funds, but we also have the capabilities to manage this. So I think that there was a way in which Ethiopia was really exerting a lot of agency around how it was setting itself up at that time. Now, it didn't work out for a number of reasons, partly because ARA got a little bit sidelined by some of the other ministries that took over, partly because some of the funds were not forthcoming or didn't come on the right time frame for them to do something about it, partly because some of the programming was not as well conceived as it might be. For example, work in industrial parks, is that really work that refugees want to do? Like, there were some questions about some of the policies themselves. And then, of course, there was a war and a sea change of governance in Ethiopia, and everything changed. But there was that moment when I think Ethiopia was trying to sort of, in some ways, maybe decolonize that donor-recipient relationship by playing a really significant role and pointing out, as a leader in this area globally, like, you need us. The world needs places like Ethiopia to play these roles, and setting up, for better or for worse, we can do this, right? We can do this. We can be a place that refugees want to stay. So I thought that was a really interesting moment of shaking up that sort of traditional power dynamic between donor and recipient. Unfortunately, for all kinds of reasons, we never saw it fully play out because it was sort of ruptured in the beginning.
Yeah, I think you're touching on something very important there. I think oftentimes we look at some of these countries as agencyless. Increasingly, they are becoming very clever customers. Ethiopia is one, but Kenya now is slowly emerging as another country where now solutions to migration is becoming their calling card at the table. Uganda was for a while, because the entire aid industry, I think, is got serious problems in where what is sexy out there. Because it's an industry where, success rate is incredibly marginal. So any country that does barely above average is seen as a country, is a tyranny of low expectation. So there is that sense where now each of these countries are now after terrorism, where terrorism was incredibly over-instrumentalized and Western countries invested poured money, training, and everything, we are going in the same direction in the aid. You know, you talk about the power imbalance, but I think there is a fair degree of some of these countries or agencies within these countries becoming incredibly, if you will, nuanced on how they play this. There's a fair degree of fear, you know, because the political cost for Western countries is significantly higher. So if you find a country, if you're a government that is in power before things change, and say we've had this agreement with Rwanda, with Kenya, whether it's directly or via, UNHCR, IOM, and the rest, it becomes really a good point for you. That's why third country processing, even here with Guatemala, now potentially for Haitian refugees through other countries, it becomes an incredibly politically useful thing for you to say and to your constituent to ensure that you are not attacked for being, weak on immigration. The question around Somalia and Somaliland, I think it's a very important question because it's a question that is getting a fair degree of attention, at least here, where Somaliland is trying to play, against the fact that, look, Mogadishu is disorganized, Mogadishu is dysfunctional, we are good, we can do this, we've had elections. But I think it is an area also, if they are not very careful, they could overplay their hands. And knowing all African Union, where territorial integrity and all that becomes very important, I think even for the United States, it can only push so far, but it's something that we should keep an eye on, not because of the traditional actors like the US and others, but also for non-traditional actors that are getting into the horn, Gulf countries, whether UAE, Qatar, as well as, Turkey. That is one to keep an eye on. Return, as well as, minorities. I think I just want to say one thing. It's a question of management of migration, and then there's the question of protection. Management is a very dry way of not addressing the question. It's efficiency. The primary thing is efficiency. How many people can we process, how many time and whatever. Whereas protection, you don't need anything for you to be protected. It is an inherent right that you enjoy as a migrant, as a refugee, and that. So I think the language on framing around, migration management, it's very benign. It's a very benign bureaucratic way, but it's not any less insidious in the way that we stop talking about protection now. Rights become something that is very peripheral. All we are interested is efficiency, because even if you want to sell it to your constituent and others in the media, narrative shaping, it becomes very easy. Who is against management? Nobody will say that we shouldn't manage, we should manage. But in reality, it is inherently very, very dangerous, but benign on the surface.
I think we have time for one more round of questions. So please, let's grab a few more questions and have another. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for your expertise today. I'm learning so much. I really appreciate it. I'm Barbara Wien and I teach here. I'm wondering if you can point me to any studies that instead of seeing migratory patterns, asylum seekers, immigrants as deficits, that actually have been able to measure the benefits of all of these good folks moving around, relocating, and their contributions. Could we flip the script? Are there economic studies? Are there reports you could point me to that actually weigh the benefits of this instead of seeing them as a deficit? Migrants are assets. They are wonderful contributors to society and have so much vibrancy going on underneath the surface, even in the refugee camps I've visited. There's incredible entrepreneurial spirit going on in there. How could we harness that? Do you know of economic studies that you could point me to? And I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the literature on this or the scholarship from the economic disciplines. Thank you.
Thanks, great. Another question.
I wanted to ask if any of you can speak to or have any views on the potential role that the African Union either is or could be doing to also better facilitate that non-colonial-esque relationship between African countries and traditional donor countries throughout Europe and the United States to kind of bring that, things they could do to bring that agency a little bit more back to the national and the regional perspective.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Tristan. I'm a student. So as a student, I don't know nearly as much as any of you guys, obviously. And my job is really just to, listen and take in information. And from a lot of what I've heard from here and in classes and just in general, I've gotten that a lot of the times we're very solution based. We see a problem, we want to immediately think of a solution, immediately think, what can we do? What can I do? What can, the US do? What can the EU do? Blah, 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 right? And I guess for me, I was wondering, do you think that we stop and think whether or not the solutions that we're implementing are actually effective or reasonable for the countries that we are, I guess, providing them to? And then even the question of should we be interfering in these ways? And one last question, which would be, if you guys were tasked with the question of how can we offer solutions that are not overbearing and that take into consideration the circumstances and context, how do we do that while also not maybe just being all right, we're not going to do anything, we're just going to stay here and do nothing? Thank you.
Great. I think we have time for one more. Yeah, you're the last one.
Thank you. And thank you all for your time today and being here for this event. Very much appreciate it. My name is Corey Hancock. I'm a master's student here at AU. And my concentration is around kind of the nexus of climate change and mobility, human mobility and immobility. So I have a question around that, given that COP27 is happening right now in Sharm el-Sheikh, and there's conversation around loss and damage. There's not really much agreement on what constitutes loss and damage. So in the context of human mobility, migration, and refugee status, is this something that should be captured within this umbrella discussion around loss and damage, given that currently a lot of climate-related displacement is internal, but very quickly it's going, I'm of the opinion in my mindset that it might be external. So how can we as an international community better serve people who are forcibly displaced from their homes to where it's not, there's not, the xenophobic perspective to say we're going to keep these certain people out because they're coming from these areas, but more so recognizing the intense impact that climate change is affecting on all of us. Is that something worth considering within loss and damage? Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks so much for that question. Yeah, really a good week to think about it. So excellent. Who would like to start us off? Amina, yeah, or Falaga.
Thank you about your question. So I have, but it is, I don't know if you can read French. You can. Good. Okay, un peu. Someone, he's a French guy, French researcher, made some research on the Yemeni contribution to the Djibouti economics, because when Yemeni came after the war, when they came in Djibouti as refugees, they invested a lot. So Djibouti government changed the law in order to enable the refugees to work, and they can have a free movement. So Yemeni came, I think, with some fund, and they invested in the Djiboutian economy, and so they contribute to the economic development of Djibouti. And this guy, I will give you his name, wrote some papers on the Yemeni contribution to the Djiboutian economic development.
Thank you so much.
These are really great questions, and I think I'll just try to address some of them. In terms of, I think, the literature, so I'm sure if I find the economic aspect of it, I'll definitely would be happy to send you, but it is not on top of my head. But just to think about the potential of role of AU in the African countries and, moving away from this or decolonizing the whole idea of, relationship between the West and the South. I think efforts that are taking place in Africa, I can take the example of the peace agreement between Ethiopia and the Tigray government. The peace agreement was done by the African Union. It was organized and it was facilitated and done within, the African countries. And this was a very strong pushback from, the Ethiopian government to say, we want to be, negotiated. We want to go through that process through the African Union. So states have started to, navigate their ways of challenging this colonial relationships or past colonial relationships, or claiming their power and agency in how to manage the relationships. And there's also, different processes talking about, having the United States of Africa, where there could be a free trade, a free movement, which is going to require definitely a lot of logistics and, many policies and engagements. But there are initiatives actually, taking power back from such a sort of a domination that has been going on. In terms of, again, the solutions, if the solutions are effective or not, and what kind of solutions should be provided, I think for a longer period of time, if you look at peace and security related interventions, migration and other development problems, there has always been a one-size-fits-all kind of policy prescriptions from the US, from the Europes, and every donor organizations. And I think going back to what I've said earlier, agency and claiming, the power relationship between the West and the South is something is taking place. I think it's something that needs to be continued by the African states. In terms of, again, climate change and migration, whether it needs to be, integrated into this whole idea of putting it into the agenda. Again, if we look at, for example, climate change, there's, I think, carbon selling or carbon sharing, where the West actually pays African countries for the number of trees that are being planted, while they're continuing their, process of industrialization and other carbon emissions. Again, I believe the West is very much dependent on African countries, and the solution is within African countries, but it shouldn't, again, be about providing aid. There should be, measures and policies that force the Western countries to actually take actions rather than moving our responsibilities to other countries.
Thanks. Any closing part? Yeah.
So these are really a great, terrific set of really terrific set of closing questions. I wish I could just pop out a whole bunch of studies. I will, if you give me your email, I will find them. I will program. But first, I just want to emphasize that there is no doubt that immigrants and refugees improve societies. And I was just having a conversation with someone about population growth and youth populations, and if we buy into, and this is a big if, but if you buy into the idea that sort of growth-oriented capitalism is sort of the way we get economic strength, you need a youthful population for that. And most of Western Europe and North America has an aging population, and other parts of the world don't. So there's an argument to be made right there, but I don't do that work, so I don't know who's written about it. But and then there's other studies that are less oriented around growth-based capitalism. And I'll try to track some down, because I think it's important to have those citations, and I don't have them off the top of my head. I was intrigued by the question about solutions and how do we have solutions that are not overbearing. I think first you need to really think about how are you defining your problem before you define your solution. That if you think the problem is a migration crisis, as you just broke down for us, the solutions are going to be problematic by themselves in a lot of ways. So you need to look at first how you're defining your problem. But if you're looking at the needs for protection and greater resources to be put towards refugee protection in the places that we're talking about in the Horn of Africa, I want to flag Lauren's work, which provides some great solutions, looking at and other work on localization that really takes an honest approach to localization. Localization, of course, can be problematic because it can also be an excuse to pull resources away, right? But a combination of approaches that take localization seriously and really look at good work that people are already doing in places, and also then doesn't pull funding away and funds those things. In Amanda, in my book, we talk a little bit about things that refugees were doing already to make their own lives better, and were often either not supported or just totally ignored and not seen by aid organizations, but yet they were often really vital to just people having decent lives at times. So one way to not be overbearing is to look at what people are already doing in very difficult circumstances and then fund that, right? Obviously, that's very complex. Loss and damage is a really interesting question, and just to push it, climate change, of course, is a site where that conversation can occur. But I think we also need to think about loss and damages for other things that have occurred, loss and damages for wars started in other countries, for colonialism, for slavery, that I think thinking about refugee protection, migration as part of this broader equation of this whole set of losses and damages, I think is a really important conversation to have.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think there are studies, I'll send them to you. I think there's Alexander Betts from Oxford. I mean, he's doing a ton of work on refugees broadly in Kenya, largely. I'll be biased, so I make that very clear. World Bank, I think a few years ago, did Yes in my backyard. If I get your email, I'll be able to send them to you. There is an implicit assumption, I mean, like we all know that, diverse population that has its own advantages, right? And the danger really, again, is it becomes a slippery slope. If we do not see people for who they are, I mean, like refugees have protection in law. I mean, like all the countries, most of the countries have signed to it. But if we start saying, the only reason we'll have you in is because of your economic contribution, then we are again creating some problem. I understand the reasons why we have to have, criteria based and all that kind of discussion. But that's the danger, because they are automatically going to be commodified, and that really creates more problems. Climate change. I think there's the Green Climate Fund to take care of some of these things. The reality is, like, for instance, Somalia is the ground zero of climate change, right? But for most of these countries, to really access the Green Climate Fund is an incredibly punishing process. Like, the process in itself is so difficult. Like, you speak to Somali government officials, they say they would rather not do it. So I think even with climate change, to take care of that, Somalia contributes probably less than 1%. But it is bearing the cost right now as we speak. In the next few weeks, if not in the next few days, if not weeks, they will declare a famine in South Central Somalia. Right. And then you're telling Somalis, I mean, like, we're trying to do. So loss and damages, whether COP27 agrees on it, whether anything comes out of it, it is something that we will have to address, because it's going to be, it's going to, destroy some of the gains that some of these countries have made over the last few years, right? I mean, sure, I mean, like, we are going into economic crisis on the back of COVID and all other problems, but I think some of those damages would be so severe that it will become very difficult, and it will become so expensive. For instance, if a country or even an individual, they probably have 10 cows, and after they lose their first 5 cows and you help them, they will be able to withstand it. It will take you less. But when they have lost all the 10 cows that they have, it will require you more, right? And them more to come, to a level where they will not be dependent. So I think there is an inbuilt reality that climate change doesn't care our feelings. It's not going to babysit our feelings. It's not going to babysit our borders and that. And if we do not wrestle with it now and try and deal with it, we'll be running into problems. There are a ton of studies out there demonstrating that early intervention saves lives, livelihoods, and it's also cost effective. Late intervention has got, other stuff. Thank you so much for hosting us, all of you, and thank you for coming. It's been a pleasure being amongst you.
Well, we're the ones to thank you all. So thank you, Abdullahi. And I want to thank you all again, each of the panelists, on behalf of the audience. Maybe we can clap one more time for all of them. You know, I will say just as a wrap up, to thank everyone for coming this afternoon, to thank our panelists. You know, when Professor Cruz and I conceived of this, and I really appreciate the critical comments about crisis of migration. We very much were thinking in the ways that you all are, that the crisis is not a crisis of migration, but it's a crisis of our thinking about migration. It's a crisis of policy. It's a crisis of protection. And I'm so grateful to you all for the ways that you've helped us to critically think about that, and that so many of us care to continue to be really critical about that. And so I encourage us, we have some food and drinks here, and as much as you possibly can, please stay and continue that conversation, meet the panelists and continue your conversation with them, so that we can continue to talk about this. So thank you all again.